Hey, I thought it would be cool if I showed you guys how I make my maps for world building and give some insight for how I designed them. This specific map is for the western half of a place in my setting called Otrian. It's going to be this big arid desert with barbarian tribes and a mix of western themes and tropes. First, I started out by making a basic blob of landmass with a little sliver of water on the side for the ocean. Next, I gave the land a kind of yellow-brown color to represent it being this arid landscape. I started to add some mountains, but I decided to put in the major trade route first since that's central to this project. I wanted to have that baseline so I could work around it. I went back and added the mountain range that acts as the northern border of Otrian, but it's unfinished and will be adjusted later. The next thing I wanted to establish was the sand dune region to the south. I gave it a lighter color to help distinguish it from the northern part, and did my best to feather it so the two regions blend together. Most biomes don't have hard borders where they just abruptly stop and the other biome begins, so I think blending it helps it look more natural. I tried a more red color for the base desert, but I didn't quite like the look of it, so I dialed it back to be that yellow-brown, but with a tinge of red. I added another mountain range to break up the landscape some more, so it wasn't just this super flat expanse. The next thing was the town icon. Along the trade route, there's this popular trading post town, and I had a hard time figuring out which symbol to use. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter at all, so I just picked one. I also added another symbol to represent the port city at the end of the road. I usually don't do symbols for settlements, but this map is going to be a little barren since it's a desert, so I thought they might make the map look a little nicer. I got the idea to have a big oasis in the middle of the sand dunes, so I dropped in a lake symbol and gave the water a vibrant color to stand out. I also had another idea to have a ruined barbarian city in another part of the dunes that's mostly buried by sand. Then I went back to the oasis and gave it a building because I want there to be some kind of settlement. Another important thing to establish was the fort on the eastern side of the map. I'll have more to say about its lore in another video. I tried messing around with other symbols for the trade town, but I couldn't make anything work better, so I just left it. I wanted to have a little bit of green to represent the grass plains in eastern Otrian, so I added that and then did my best to blend the biomes together. I think the blending is something I fidget with all throughout the process, so it's almost never finalized until the end. The oasis seemed a little too close to the plains since I wanted it to be deep in the heart of the sand dunes, so I moved it to the west some more. I did some more blending, and then I decided to add some cliffs around the oasis because it seemed cool. The next thing was to add some green to the coast to show that things get a little less arid there, but I put too much, so I think I adjusted that later. I wanted the mountains to have some contrast, so I gave them a darker brown and added a slightly less dark brown under them to help separate the mountain regions from the desert. Then I thought the coastline looked a little too straight, so I chopped some of it off to add some irregularity. I'll give some more insight about irregularity in a bit. To help further distinguish the sand dunes from the northern desert, I added a bunch of little bumpy hill symbols and made sure they were the same color as the ground beneath them. Now, speaking of that irregularity, I started to erase some of the blobbed coastline to make it more jagged and imperfect, like an actual coastline. I didn't have any specific method to this, I just wiggled my mouse randomly with a small brush size. I messed around with the coast options until I settled on something that I liked. I was very indecisive. I didn't record it, but I added another part to that northern mountain range to break up the landscape some more. Then I colored the new mountains so they fit with the rest of their siblings. After looking at the map some more, the sizes of the oasis symbols were bothering me. They looked a little too big. I deleted the building and palm trees and used Wonderdraft's default oasis symbol, and then I scaled the cliffs down so they took up less space. Outside of Wonderdraft, I made my own black spiky symbols to represent an idea I had for an area where a bunch of obsidian spikes are sticking out of the ground. I added some of those symbols and messed around with the shape until it looked nice to me. I'm not sure if that will be the final location of the spiky region, but it can be easily moved if I change my mind. Rivers aren't very common in deserts, but I wanted to have at least one. The valley in the northeast seemed like a good place to start it, and I thought having it eventually run parallel to the trade road would make sense, since that road would probably follow the river. Next, and it's very faint, I added some green around the river to represent the vegetation that would be around it. And then I added some more green to the valley. I will get back to that soon. I added another river to the northwest because I felt like it. And then I went back to adjusting the oasis again. It's been a very troublesome landmark for me. I wasn't quite done with the dunes, so I gave the region some more hills to make it more, duney. Going back to the valley, I wanted there to be at least one somewhat densely forested area. I figured that it might make sense to be this place since it could have a bunch of smaller streams and rivers feeding into the main river. The water probably comes from melting snow from the mountains. I was pretty happy with it, but the border felt too clean, so I added some straggler trees at the edge to make it look like the forest was thinning out. On the eastern side, I wanted to have some rocky terrain, so I added some mountain symbols. Unfortunately, it didn't really look good to me. It seemed like just a tiny mountain range, which wasn't what I was going for, so I scrapped it. After a bit of thought, I decided to rework the trade route slightly. I wanted it to match up more evenly with the river. I followed the original path, but changed it to where it needed to be. The mountains were still looking a little unfinished to me, so I added some smaller extensions and filled in some of the gaps. I also added some smaller ranges for variety, and gave the mountains some finishing touches. Next, I added some forests. I figured the river in the northwest would have some decent vegetation, and parts of the main river would have spots with enough trees that you could consider them as wooded areas. I added another forest in the middle of the desert because there's probably an oasis there to give the trees enough water. After that, the last thing was to place some hills across the region to give it some texture. And with that, I believe the map is done. For now, at least. This gives me a really good starting point to flesh out the lore, and I can add more things or move stuff around to fit the needs of the setting. If you like this kind of content, leave a comment and let me know. I might make more of these if you guys like to see this kind of stuff. The next video will be an overview of the lore of this place, so stay tuned.